Welcome back to Fixing Furniture. My name's Scott Bennett and I'm the co-owner here of Wouldn't It Be Nice Furniture Repair. We've got a customer who brought in two very similar stools and she'd like them set to the same height so she can use them in her kitchen. There's also a few issues with it. There have been some stretchers here that have been repaired and they haven't used the proper material. We've also got some paint splatters along here, but the customer wants to keep the original finish. So this is not about stripping furniture, this is about taking off some of that paint in a sensitive way. You can see here we've got wear marks on one stool, but not on the other. So the customer's asked that I wear them the same so they look very similar. This is one of my favorite types of projects. It's not about making these look perfect, it's about making this stool look much more similar to this stool so they look like a set. Stick with me, I'll show you how it's done.
As a furniture repair business, we're opening the doors to our workshop to show you the tools and techniques to repair furniture.
The front rail here, you can see this has been broken off.
We give you tips to make your repair projects easier. Let's get into the workshop and start fixing furniture.
Sponsored by Kennedy Hardware, offering restoration hardware for antique furniture. These stools have some sentimental value for the customer. The customer's father was a bank manager, and these stools came out of a bank branch in Scarborough, Ontario. So these aren't supposed to be looking new, they are supposed to be looking aged. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to age this stool to look like this one. Now, when I get this all together, what I'm going to do is take you to my Jack Daniels bar that I designed and built, and we'll set these up there and we'll take a look. So the first thing I need to do is focus on these stretchers, and I need to take the stool apart to do that. I'll turn this on the side and you can see what these stretchers look like. Underneath here you can see that there's some bare wood, there's no stain on that. So that's where the original part would have been. These are rectangular stretchers. So someone had taken a dowel here, put a shoulder on, and then installed that. So I'm going to label all the parts here and take the stool apart. The hardware used in furniture can tell you a bit of the story. So you can see here there's been some repair work, but down here I've got a square drive screw, and it's rather large. That's a Robertson screw. These were invented in Canada. Down here I've got a regular slotted screw. The square drive Robertson screw in the stool tells me that this was made after the turn of the century. The Robertson screw was patented in 1909 and it's a proud Canadian invention. All of our woodworking screws in Canada are Robertson square drive. So the slotted screw here in the seat, if this is original, tells me that this was made somewhere during the transition period of adopting these screws. Now these screws are great. I'll show you a little bit about what makes them so great. But if you're working on furniture that doesn't have Robertson screws, they weren't adopted that much in the US. If you find a Phillips, for example, they were patented in 1936. So these are some of the hints that can give you an idea of how old the piece is that you're working on. Robertson screwdrivers are color-coded, so the red is what's typically common for wood screws, the green is more typical of small hardware, the black is what I need for this project. Now because of the square geometry on this, it's got fantastic grip to be able to pull out screws and put them in. So with a Phillips screw you might have something that strip. With a Robertson screw, that doesn't happen. And look at that, it stays on the end of your screwdriver. I can now pull this apart, set this aside, and set up my stretcher clamps here to gently ease these pieces apart. You want to avoid using a mallet if you can. As I'm taking this apart here, it's splitting, and that's because of an unfortunate repair that someone has done before. The split here is caused by a finishing nail driven in here, so this would have been a loose tenon here, and someone decided to put a nail in to hold it together. That's not the way to repair furniture. So we'll set this on the bench here and pull out that finishing nail. I find the best tool for doing this is a mini cat's paw. It allows me to get under that head and create as little damage as possible while extracting it. Now this should come apart, yep, but we've got more nails up here. These ones are finishing nails driven in from the end, so I just need to pull a little harder and I'll be able to get these out. Okay, so when you're taking out finishing nails like this, you do have to be careful that you don't split the wood on the back. These finishing nails are just slightly below the surface, so it shouldn't be an issue, but if you've got finishing nails that are sunk in, countersunk, what you might have is wood that splinters out at the top and the bottom when you push it out. So I'll tap these out a little bit and see how they come out. So they're coming out clean so far. I just have to be careful as I pull them out, I don't cause damage around the wood here. Now as I pull out the nail, I want to make sure I'm pulling it out in a straight line. If I just start reefing on this, see, I could be pulling it in a way that I'm getting on an angle, and that's an opportunity for the wood fibers to tear out. So by putting a second block here, I can just keep pulling it out in that straight line, and it won't cause any wood damage. Now if I move these pieces, I can tell they're all loose, so I need to take this chair apart, but on the bottom stretchers here on the inside, we've got finishing nails. So in order to prevent splitting it out like what happened over here, I need to take those finishing nails out first, and then I can take the stool apart. I'm going to use a cat's paw to get under the finishing nail head and pull it out. It is going to cause some damage, but this is on the inside of the stool, so it's going to be easier to disguise that than if it were on the outside. With the nails out, I can now take this apart, and I'll do the same thing with the rest of the stool here. So we've got all the parts separated. I've got all the pieces apart here, and one of the challenges is going to be the tenons on the end here. So I have to create two of these stretchers, but if you look at them here, they're not straight, they're on an angle. That's going to be very difficult to make. I'll lay out the parts on the bench here, and we can take a closer look. So if I hold this roughly level, you can see how the direction of this goes, and then that goes in an upward angle. So I was thinking I could do this on the lathe, but that's not going to work because it would have to be perfectly straight out here. So just to take a look, this is what I have to reproduce. I need to figure that one out. Now I've done a lot of custom woodworking, but I have never cut a round tenon with a square shoulder on an angle like this before. So when I work through a challenge like this, what I want to do is mill down the lumber first and then figure out how I'm going to solve this problem here. I can tell that this tenon here is perpendicular to the angle, so I know that I can cut that, and that gives me a reference point. I think I'm going to have to order a plug cutter to get that size, and then somehow figure out how to get it located in the right spot once I've got the lumber milled up. One of the secrets to matching stain is making sure you're using the same wood as what's in the original piece. So from lots of experience, I can tell from this little piece of wood here that this is birch, but wood is difficult to identify. Here I've got a worn down piece of the stretcher. You can see the rounded profile there. So if we take some sandpaper, we can start to wear off the finish here, and that can give you a better indication as to what wood you might be working with. So I'm not going to sand this all the way through, but that just gives you an idea. This is birch, so I'm going to go to the wood pile and we'll get some birch to mill up. The size of material I'm looking for is just over 3/4 of an inch, and 3/4 of an inch is typical of what I've got in the wood pile here. I do have some large birch here, and I've got some birch here. That looks like that will be the right dimension to work with. Now for regular viewers, you notice I've got some white material here in the pile. This isn't wood, this is actually plastic, this is PVC. So this PVC trim I'm experimenting with, it's a new material that's now in hardware stores. So it's meant for areas that are going to get moist and wet. So I'm putting this on a newel post I'm building in the front of the house to make sure that in the future it doesn't rot. It cuts just like wood, so it's pretty easy to use. So ideally what I can do is get enough wood here so I can cut both of these out at once, but I'm going to have some planer snipe, so I think what I'll do is just plane this whole board down to the right thickness, and then I can cut my strips out. I can use the blade in my miter saw to guess the angle of this piece, but it's not accurate enough to build furniture. What you need to use is a T-bevel. Now don't be tempted to use a T-bevel on a small piece like this because this reference surface isn't large enough. It won't give you an accurate measurement. So what I do is I've seated this joint really well. I'll line this up on both reference surfaces, and now I can measure the angle. So I put this on my saw set, and it tells me I've got a 9-degree angle. I dial that in on the miter saw, and I've got a perfect cut. Now this saw set is a Canadian invention, and we're giving one of these away to the members of our Fixing Furniture community. You can check that out at fixingfurniture.com, and if you join by July 31st, you'll be put into the raffle to win one of these, and we'll ship it to you wherever you are in the world. Now, I've only cut one end on these. This is the first time I'm doing this joinery, so if I make a mistake here, I can just cut it off, and I've got lots of wood to continue working on it. So I'll lay out the lines here, and then we'll put it in the vise. So what I do here is line up the end of the tenon with the end of the board, and then what I can do is mark where the shoulders are, here and here. And if I hold my pencil straight up and down against that, that'll give me a line for either side of the tenon, and I'll double check that with calipers. Now it's more efficient to lay out multiple pieces at a time, so I'll just line this up, pull out my T-bevel, and that gives me this line here. Lay out where the tenon should be, and I can get out my square and start tracing these lines around the outside. Now we need these lines around the outside, so what I'll do is line up the square here, extend the line across, because what I need to do is cut this with a handsaw, so I need the line all the way around. So on this side, what I can do is extend the line using the T-bevel, line it up here, and as I rotate this, you can see this line is continuous around the piece. So now I use the calipers to measure the diameter here, and it's 5/8. So I'll just double check here that those lines are a little bit wider than 5/8, and they are. So I'll extend the lines of the tenon around the end here, and we'll figure out where the center of this tenon needs to be. I'm going to put this in the vise, and what I want to do is keep this line here level. It's going to make it much easier when I have to start working on this piece, just to gauge where everything is. So now I can draw the lines across the top here. So with these two lines, I just want to figure out where the center of this is. Right here. And then I'm going to get out my Forstner bit. The easiest way to lay out a round tenon is by using a Forstner bit and just starting to drill a little bit. So line it up on this line, you'll see what I mean. So now I'll add a layout line to the back here and the front, and I can pull out the handsaw. I've got a couple different saws in my tool cabinet. This is a flush cut saw. Absolutely love this. This is a dovetail saw, but when I'm looking for really accurate joinery, this is what I gravitate to. This is a Dizuki saw. It's a Japanese saw, so it works in the pull stroke. There's another Japanese saw here. This is a Ryoba, and it's got two different sets of teeth on here, but this is more for general woodworking. Now when I'm cutting lines like this with a Japanese style saw, because it cuts in the pull stroke, I want to start at the far corner here because all this material back here supports the cut. So I'll cut along this line here and then work my way down to this line here, and that way I've got a line exactly where I need it. With those two sides cut, what I need to do now is make the layout lines here. So I'll just use my finger as a guide on the pencil, and I can draw the lines down here. So there you go. It's all cut out now. So we've got a square. What I'll do is cut off the angles here, so I've got an octagon. And then tomorrow, hopefully, my plug cutter will be in, and we can make that perfectly round. Just pulling these two pieces up here, I can see I've done something wrong. You see how the tenon's going straight out here? I made the mistake of making that parallel with this piece. If I put the square on here, you can see that the tenon is perpendicular to this line here, and I didn't do that here. So I'll have to cut that off, start over again, and hopefully the second time I'll get it right. Okay, so here we go. Now that looks much better. I'm going to leave this other one with just the lines on it. We'll see how the plug cutter works tomorrow, and then I can continue on working with the joinery. Making mistakes are part of a learning process, and that's okay, as long as you're doing it safely. Here I had excess material, and that allows me to change the end here, so I'm not wasting a piece of work. So don't be discouraged by mistakes. It's something that you'll learn from, and you'll remember the next time you go to do something. I'm going to take a break right now. What we're going to do is come back tomorrow. I've got that plug cutter come in the shop here, and then we'll continue on with the joinery. Well, my plug cutter came in. So this is billed as a plug cutter, dowel cutter, and tenon cutter. And it's carbide tipped, which means it won't be burning like the regular steel ones are. I find those ones frustrating because they become dull so quickly. So if you're in it for the long term, plug cutters with carbide tip is definitely what you want. So let's give this a try. Now, if I just try to run this tenon cutter right on the top here, it's going to want to move around on me. So what I'm going to do is bevel the top edges there, and I'll give it somewhere to start, and then I can start cutting. I've never seen someone use this technique before, so we're going to find out if it works. The key is to make sure that this is level, so when I sight the drill bit here, I make sure that I've got it as level as possible, and I should have a straight tenon. That looks pretty good. So we compare it to the other one, and that's looking good. Let's see how it fits in the stool. So pull this one out, put this one in, and let's see, is it at the right angle? Well, it's off just a little bit. Is there any play in it? Oh, there we go. Okay, there's just a little bit of a gap there, so I just need to clean that up with a chisel, and we'll have a perfect joint. Well, I'm glad this tenon cutter works so well. It's going to make for quick work. If you don't have a tenon cutter, you can use a chisel to work your way around that tenon and get it perfectly round. So I now have to cut my pieces to length, work on the ends, and then what I can do is reassemble the stool. The replacement stretchers are ready, but to avoid a potential problem, what I'm going to do is dry fit it first. This is the best practice of building furniture. Dry fit it, make sure you can tune up those joints before getting out your bottle of glue, because once you're in the middle of a glue up, you don't have the opportunity to make any changes. So let's take a look at the joints here. You can see we've got a good tight joint here at the top. For some reason this tenon isn't seating, so I have to look at the mortise. Now that I have the stool together, what I'm going to do is label where each of these joints are, and that way I can take the stool apart and I can work on the joints individually to make sure they're going to fit properly. Here's the problem. There's a big glob of glue in the bottom of this mortise, and in the bottom of this one, someone's glued in a block of wood, so I'll have to clear those out. So the joints here are now fitting tightly, and before I put it together I need to sand these parts. I also need to wear down the top stretcher, because the top stretcher is where someone puts their foot, and this has got lots of wear on it. So I want to do that so I don't damage the legs if I were to assemble it and do it afterwards. So I'll put that here for reference. I'll take this one off here. I can use this as my guide as to what to wear off the stretcher. You can see it's much more worn here than it is at the edge here where a foot can't reach. So I've got this to the profile that I want with a sander, but you can see if you look real close, there's some texture in here. So this wasn't originally damaged with a sander, this was damaged with boots that probably had stones in them. So what I need to do is rough up this piece so it's got some of that texture as well. Now sometimes people use odd tools for texturing, but you got to be careful that you're not introducing a recognizable pattern. So for example, don't use a hammer on here because you'll end up noticing that there's a pattern of a hammerhead on it. So I'll just go through this, add some detail here. I'm going to rough up the back of it with a rasp, and that should get it looking fairly similar to the existing piece. Okay, so now I've got some texture there. That's what I'm looking for. It'll be good to stain it up and then wear it down. I'm now all set to glue up the stool. So I'll glue it together with hide glue, clamp it up, set it aside. I need to take the other stool apart and re-glue it as well because it's loose. Once I've done that and the glue's dried, I can then shorten the stool so they'll both be the same height. The glue on the stool has now dried, so I can finish taking the clamps off of it. The next step is to put the seats back on here and figure out how much I need to take off the legs of this stool to make them the same height. I'll put a level on the seat here, hold up a measuring tape. So I need to take off 2 3/4. Now to trim off the legs, because I've got this taken apart, it's fairly easy to put this on the miter saw. My miter saw is a compound miter saw, meaning it can cut multiple angles at once. So I'll set that up and trim it off. Now, if you don't have access to that, or the stool or chair isn't taken apart, I do have a video that shows how to shorten the legs on a chair or stool. You can check that out. It's on our home improvement woodworking channel. I'll leave a link in the video description below. I'll start by measuring how much I need to take off here. I'll set the saw here to 9 degrees, and then I'll set my bevel to 9 degrees as well. Now what I'll do is line up my cut line here, and then I'll set up a stop block so I get all 4 of these cuts exactly the same. This is a scrap that has a 90-degree angle on it, so I'm going to use that because it's going to match here. So I'll just hold that in place, slide in my stop block, lock it down, and now I've got a reference point. Okay, so let's see how this works. Okay, there we go, same height. There's a bit of wobble to this one. There's a bit of a wobble to this one as well. I'll just get out my Dizuki saw and trim that up. And when a chair wobbles like this, you can see it moving up and down. It means that this leg is too long. So what I need to do is take that gap, cut that amount off there, and then this won't wobble anymore. I'll mark it on two sides here, and then turn it on its side. Okay, let's see how we did here. Just barely rocking. Just a little bit more with a plane, we'll be good to go. And there we go, no rocking. So I'll move this aside here. We'll reattach the seat. I'll do the same with the other one. So now I can stain these pieces here and then clean off the paint that's all over the stools. To match the stain, I'm going to turn it upside down, and that way I can work on the underside, or I can experiment with a couple colors. I've chosen two dark stains here, so I'll just put a little bit on either side here. That one's looking pretty good. This one, I think that one's actually a better match. So we'll start by staining the underside of the stool first, and then I'll work my way to the front. So it's just a matter of applying the right amount of stain and then coming back and wiping it off the excess. I've already filled the nail holes that were here before, so I'll just touch those up as I go through the staining process here. Get them all to the same stage. It's reading a little bit brown. It needs to be a little bit darker, but this stain does dry lighter. So I've got a sample here I've done up, so I can put a clear coat on it and see what it looks like compared to the rest. Now there is paint splatter here, so that's changing the color a little bit. So it's just a little bit of balancing back and forth to make sure that these are going to match the rest of the stool. These new stretchers are looking better, but there's a few more steps yet. Stain matching can be a tricky thing, and a lot of people ask me questions about that. In September, we're going to have a live session where people can ask questions in our Fixing Furniture community. If you'd like to learn more about the live sessions that we host and the rest of the benefits around the Fixing Furniture community, go to fixingfurniture.com. Now I'm going to take off the paint here and see how much we can get cleaned up. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, the customer wants these cleaned up, but they don't want them refinished. So what I'm going to do is test some spots here. I'm going to use vinegar to start with. If this is latex paint, that should loosen it up. There's some black stuff here, but these are going to look worn. So I don't want to use a paint stripper to take everything back to bare wood. Just move the vinegar around here and let it sit for about 5 minutes. It won't damage the finish, but we'll see how much this will lift off of the old finish. So what I've got here is a plastic razor blade. This won't damage the wood, but it'll allow me to scrape off some of this debris. Okay, so there's a little bit coming off there. Now there's probably a mix of latex, oil-based paint here, so I'm not sure how much I can get off, but I'll gently scrape over the material here. Well, you can see there's white stuff's coming off here. That's good. So just going to take some elbow grease. So that's done a little bit, but not enough. So I'm moving on to the next harshest chemical, and that's a degreaser. So I'm going to spray this on here, let it sit for a few minutes, and then see what we can clean off. Now I'm going to move on to an abrasive. So I'm going to put a little bit of the degreaser here on some of these worst spots. And then scrub it and see what happens. So I'm starting to get down to bare wood here, and I don't want to do that, so I'm going to try mechanical means. I've got a card scraper here. You can see how this is layered. There's a piece of paint there that's almost matching the chair. And I'm using a curved scraper, so I'm just getting right to the spot that I want to scrape at without gouging the seat. It is looking like bare wood underneath there, so I might need to end up staining this after all. After about 15 minutes of scraping, I am getting it clean here, but you can see it's getting down to bare wood. Here there was some glue, so that's come off, and there's bare wood there. There's a swath of brown paint across here. So really, I could spend hours working through this and trying to get everything off sensitively, but I'm not happy with what this is looking like here. So I'm going to take a sander and sand the whole thing off, start over again, and then use stains to age this and make it look similar to the other stool. This light colored line here is telling me that this is a high point from the sander, which means this piece is leaning out this way. So I'm going to undo it from the bottom, see if I can break that apart and get that closed back up again. On the bottom here, I've got a nice tight seam, but on the top here, it's not tight. So what I'm going to do is see if I can line this up on the corner of the bench here and see if it will flex. It's flexing a bit. Needs a little more push to get that to open up. There we go. So clean out all this residue here, the old wood filler, and see how close I can get that to closing up again. So I've cleaned out everything that's in here, and look at that. That looks much, much better. I'm just using a mild abrasive with some soap and water. And I'm cleaning off the surface here to get it ready for putting on some finish. So if you see how dirty this is, and these cloths that I was using to dry it off, you can see how much dirt came off just one stool. One more to go. I can now see the color of the finish better, and this is the area here that I need to mimic on this stool. So this is the existing stretcher. It looks like this has had a new coat of something on it, because all of the worn areas are dark. These are the new stretchers I made. So what I'm going to do is now go through and sand all the edges, all the surfaces. So I've got corners that look like this and stretchers that look like this. I've got the stretchers and the corner of the legs looking the way I want them, but at the bottom, because I cut the leg off, I've got a very clean line there. So I need to rough those up and make them look like this other stool. So I've got the right wear marks here, but I don't have the right color. So here it's a little bit orangey. So I need to add some here, and you can see here it's particularly light. So I think I've got the right stain here. Let me just add a little bit here. Rub it off. Yep, it looks like we're getting the right tone. So I'll go around and put that stain on. We'll see how it looks. While the stain is drying here, I'm going to put on some furniture glides. These will help protect the floor from getting damaged when the stools are moving around. Now, these are easy to install. The key is to pre-drill the hole before driving that pin in. You can eyeball the center, but I prefer to use a center finder. This is a wood turning tool. So I just put it on two sides here. That tells me where the center is. Now I take my drill bit, drill it in perpendicular. And now I've got a spot to nail on the pad. There you go. So there we've got a well-centered pad, and it matches the finish. So the stain's now dry, and can you pick out which are the stretchers were the ones that I made? It's these ones right here. You see how they're a little bit lighter? Let me get a little closer. So you can see there's a richer color here than there is over here, and that's the original that we're looking to match. So if I hold up this sample here, this has got shellac on it. So what that does is it'll enrich the color, and that should match perfectly. The finish that I'm using here is an amber shellac, and this is thicker than you'd want to put it on. It's the way I mix it up, and then we add some denatured alcohol. So this is a great finish. If you're dealing with antiques, this is the finish that was used on antiques before chemicals evolved and came around. And I'm using a natural bristle brush to put it on. If you're interested in learning how to mix up shellac from shellac flakes, we've got a reference guide on that for our community members. And there you can see the intensity of the color coming out. So with shellac, you need to just put it on and leave it. You can't overbrush it because it dries far too rapidly. So it's now been 10 minutes and the shellac is dry. That's what's great about shellac, is it dries extremely quickly, so you can get through all your coats in a short amount of time. So I'm just using 400 grit sandpaper here, knocking down the high points. I'll put on a second coat and the finish on these new stretchers will be done. You see there's a bit of a sheen on this finish, but there's not here. This is kind of looking old and dull. I've got some wipe on shellac here I'm just going to put on, and then I'll help revive the finish. With that done, I can now turn my attention to the seat here. I'll unclamp it and get it ready for stain. I'm just going to clean up this edge with a scraper, and then I'll sand it once more. And then what I'm looking to do is get this color in here. So I'm going to leave it light on the outsides, but I need to get the color tone here, here, and on the edges. When I look at matching these pieces here, this is to me where the art comes in furniture restoration. So put on color here and put it pretty close to the edge, and then I can sand away afterwards. So that first coat sort of set the tone. It didn't get me the color I wanted, so I've mixed up a color here. So this should get me much closer to what the stool is here. Let's take a look. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. And while I've got the stain out, you see there's some blotches here, so what I'm going to do is just touch up these areas here so they're less obvious in the finish. I also decided to touch up the center of this because it was a little bit light on color. So I think we're good to go. So this finish is slightly too dark compared to this, so what I'm going to do is sand it down a little bit. I need to rough it up as well. This has a varied texture to it, this doesn't. So this is part of the antiquing process. Now that's looking better. So what I want to do now is put on a couple of coats of shellac here, brush them on, and what I'll do is knock back the edges so it mimics this afterwards. I want to put the shellac on first, just so I get that feathering the way it is here. So here's where the color transformation happens. As I said, just brush this on. Don't overbrush it. And it looks like I'm going to need a little bit more orange in here. So I'll have to adjust that tone. I'm going to wipe on some shellac here just to give it some extra protection, but it's also going to help me read the color here. By mixing up some dye stain and adding it to the shellac, it allows me to tint the color to get it dialed in. I use the same tinted shellac to touch up the center of the stool. The last step is to sand off this front edge here so it looks like this, and we'll have matching stools. The last step is to knock down the gloss of the shellac. Shellac leaves a shiny finish, so I'm using 4/0 steel wool. I'll rub this out and then I'll bring it to the bar and we'll take a close-up look at how the stools turned out. Welcome to my Jack Daniels bar. Can you tell which of these two stools I shortened, restained the top, and put new stretchers on? It's this one right here. And you can see the stretchers match the rest of the stool. It's been really rewarding working on a project like this that has such sentimental value for a customer. I hope you'll enjoy this video I'm going to leave you with right here. In the meantime, cheers!